Your Excellencies, ambassadors of Argentina and Colombia, members of diplomatic missions to Australia, members of the Australian Government, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, I'd like to welcome you all here for this third conference in our series on Latin America and the shifting sands of global power. I'd like to begin the conference by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet today, whose cultures are some of the oldest on the planet, and to recognise that many of the issues that in fact we face here in Australia in relation to Indigenous rights will be repeated in the discussions that we'll have over the next 2 days. I'd like to talk a little about what we're trying to do with these conferences, because as I said, this is the third in a series of conferences, and we've chosen to call them Latin America and the Shifting Sands of Global Power, which is rather a mouthful, but what we're trying to express here is that things have been changing in the world in very important ways, and here in this country, we hear constantly the story about the Asian century, about the importance of Asia, the rise of China, of India, and so on, and that's all true. But what we want to say in this title is that the story is a bigger one than that there are other changes going on as well, and some of the most important of those changes involve Latin America. We recognise not only that Latin America is more important than it was in the past in a world sense, in terms of its economic power, in terms of its geostrategic power, but also in terms of its relationships. And one of the reasons we're here today is that Australia probably has more connections with Latin America than has ever been the case in the past. Latin America is, I think, today, to use an ugly word, much more multi-directional in terms of its relationships, both economic and political, than has been the case in the past. And that affects us right here. The focus of this, the third annual conference, is on Latin America and the resources boom. And resources booms, as you know, are not new to Latin America. In fact, in lots of ways, it was the lure of resources, of gold, the legend of El Dorado, that drew Europeans, the Spanish conquerors, in the first place to the Americas. And Latin America has gone through a series of resources booms over the last 5 centuries. Those booms have brought, in some cases, wealth, but in some cases, great problems as well to the region. In the 1980s and the 1990s, Latin America probably went through nearly the worst economic period in its entire European history. That was a period of virtually stagnant or negative economic growth. And the period since then, since the late 1990s, the early part of this century, has seen an economic resurgence, much stronger growth rates in most parts of the region. And at least a part of that has been due to the strength of the resources boom in that period. It's enabled governments in the region, through revenues they've collected in that boom, to change social policy in important ways. It's meant, for example, that tens of millions of people, as a result of that, have been drawn above the poverty level in various parts of Latin America. So there have been very important consequences of the resources boom. But resources booms throughout their history in the region and elsewhere are not always a blessing. The classic case, of course, here is the Cerro Rico of Potosí in what's now Bolivia, a place that in the late 16th and 17th century was perhaps the wealthiest part of the world. It was a mountain of silver, and its exports of silver to Europe created a currency system in Europe, enabled an expansion of a currency system in Europe that really enabled a world capitalist market to develop. You find Potosí silver in Japan. You find it in the Indian rupee. You even find it in the late 18th century in the so-called holy dollar of Australia. That's how important this resources boom was at the time for the world economy. But today, this is one of the poorest parts of the Southern Cone. The long-term result of the resources boom wasn't at all a blessing for the people of that region. And resources, of course, are finite. They're depletable, and when they're gone, they're gone, unlike other forms of economic activity. And this creates certain problems as well. For example, the passing of peak oil in some parts of the region is going to create major problems of adjustment, of economic adjustment into the future. And of course, there are environmental problems. Again, in the area that I'm particularly interested in Ecuador, there is still a major dispute going on with a US oil company about the massive damage they did to very, very delicate ecosystems, very important ecosystems in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And of course, there are major disputes. Wherever there are questions about land use and about the division of the wealth that comes from the use of resources, the extraction of resources, there are major disputes, particularly with the people in that region. And in particular, in Latin America, indigenous politics, questions of indigeneity have been drawn into these disputes in important ways. I'd like to also mention that part of the reason that we are here as a Latin American Studies Centre, and part of the reason there is more interest in Latin America in Australia, is precisely because of the question of resources. We have resources, not coal and iron and so on, but a certain amount of financial resources, not nearly enough, by the way, but we have a certain amount of resources to pursue Latin American studies because there are more Australians interested in Latin America, either Australian companies who are involved in mining in Latin America, or companies which operate both in Australia and in Latin America, providing those extra connections which stimulates interest in the region here in this country. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest speakers from the US, from Ecuador, from Bolivia, and from elsewhere in this country. Distinguished guests. I think we put together a panel of speakers for the conference who will be leaders in their field in the things that they're talking about. I'd like to also thank the university for its support for putting on this conference. We wouldn't be able to do it without the support of the various parts of the university hierarchy that fund the usual operations of ANCLAS and particularly events like this. And I'd like to thank those who've helped to put the conference together, particularly Claudia Villegas, who's up the back, who's the ANCLAS administrator, who's worked so hard to make all the arrangements and make everything happen relatively seamlessly.